can I also add?
Yes.
I see the hands of neocolonialism here, because if we're talking about the African continent and quote unquote security concerns, Botswana, where the conference was held, is deep in the belly of the continent. We're talking south-south, and is one of only maybe 3 countries that have not had military coups. Why are they
and even beyond that, they actually have a functioning economy, you know?
Yes. And so, obviously, because of the homogeneous population as well. I mean, it's largely homogeneous. So they've got diamond is one of the major exports of Botswana.
Yeah, I think they've used their resources much more judiciously.
Yeah, exactly. So the question I was asked, which I was thinking when I saw the story, was, if indeed there is a problem with security and quote unquote terrorism and rebel action and what have you, how did this problem start in the first place? Most of them are machinations of people who want access to resources on the continent, which goes back to the book that was published in 1965, Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism and the Last Stage of Imperialism, where he says, there was a part I saw there earlier, and I'll just quickly read that part. And he said, during 1962 to 1963, a number of international conferences to this end were held in several places, such as Nicosia in Cyprus, San Jose in Costa Rica, and Lagos in Nigeria. Particular participants included the CIA, the United Information Agency, the Pentagon, the International Development Agencies, the Peace Corps, and others. Programs were drawn up to talk about problems in Africa. Why, as my people would say, why are they so concerned with bereaving for more than the aggrieved? Why? I don't get it.
No, I mean, of course you get it. You know they're not concerned. You know, you get it 100%. They're not concerned. This is not the purpose of that conference. It's not to explore how to make any African country more secure. Why would they want to do that? A secure Africa would be able to use its resources to build up the economies of African countries. The US is a corporation. There's no company that I know of in the world that is going to go to subsidize another company. And they see Africa as a collection of small companies, you see, that supply them with the input to go into their big factory. And the big factory is the United States. African countries are like suppliers, you see. So, for example, if you're a Ford company here in the United States, you have suppliers. They send you the components that go into the fan, that goes into the wheel, that goes into the rim, that goes into the engine. And then you assemble all of this in the Ford plant, right? So the best way to see the United States is this big corporation, and Africa as suppliers of all these parts that a company like Ford would need. So now you're going to go to the countries of all these suppliers and say, oh, wait, I don't like it that you guys, you have conflict here. I'm going to help you end the conflict so you could become strong. You know, somebody would have to be dreaming to believe any of this. They go to destabilize. They go to destabilize, but they cannot say, we are coming to destabilize Africa. Look at what's going on in the entire Sahel region today.
Yep.
When did that start? It started when NATO went and destroyed the government of Muammar Gaddafi. And all the arsenal of weapons he had just became... I remember I saw a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal The article itself was short, but it had an aerial photograph of weapons, brand new arsenal. This is after Gaddafi had already been killed. So this weapon was stored in the desert where you don't even need to fence it off, but it's there in like huge containers, and it goes on and on and on and on. So they took an aerial photograph. These are the weapons that have been unleashed on the African people by NATO destroying the Gaddafi government. It's like whipping up a hornet's nest.
Yeah.
And now they talk about U.S. Africa security. Come on, man. In fact, Zimbabwe should be proud that they were not invited.
I mean, like you said at the beginning of reading that article, they will not be part of the chickens that have been fattened up for the
Absolutely.
So speaking of chickens, apparently, well, you did say that op-ed was a shot across the bows for South Africa. For our next story, we go to South Africa, who have been having issues with their coalition governments. And the story comes from the Financial Times of London. So the headline reads, the rough road ahead for coalition politics in South Africa. Power sharing agreement is a minor miracle, but divisions are deep. I've highlighted some parts. And first, he goes, in the lead, he says, no one should underestimate the mini miracle that has just occurred in South Africa. The African National Congress, a liberation party that has ruled unchallenged for 30 years, was humbled in a free and fair elections last month. He accepted the results, ensured a potential lurch into radical populism, and set about forming a government of national unity in which its main partner will be the market-oriented Democratic Alliance. The prospect of a centrist government bolstered by DA's proven administrative skills has energized investors. The rand and the stock market have rallied since the prospect of a coalition government became real. Investors who have not looked at South Africa seriously for 15 years are reevaluating its prospects. Cyril Ramaphosa, the centrist president, probably seen working with the DA as a chance to neutralize the more radical wing of the ANC and curb members who see politics as a means of enrichment. Hold that thought. It will not be so easy to get the ANC and the DA to work together, given their deep ideological divisions, with the DA keener on free enterprise and the ANC on state intervention. The DA could lose its political identity by working with the ANC, which has nearly doubled the number of MPs. If the DA finds itself in a surveillance role, skeptics argue it could find itself either powerless to effect real change or scapegoated for everything that has gone wrong. Beyond the immediate battering lies a more fundamental question of whether the DA can run ministries as it wishes or will have to bow to ASC diktats. It has already withdrawn its objection to a minimum wage and black empowerment legislation that it regards as prone to corruption and inefficiency. The ANC's ties with unions that often blocks attempts to reform sectors such as education. Why would you want to reform education? That's another thought. That is the sheer difficulty of conjuring the rapid growth necessary to tackle the profound economic and social divisions that make South Africa the most unequal society in the world. If the 30 years of state intervention has been unable to adequately address the legacy of apartheid, a system that deliberately engineered a black underclass, it is far from clear that a few market reforms will do the trick either. What are your thoughts, sir?
So since we've discussed South Africa previously, I'll probably just touch on a few points, and I'll just basically expose the racism that is deep-seated in this article. Okay. So, to the people that write this, they already see a betrayal by this white-led party, the Democratic Alliance, by them dropping their objection to minimum wage. Just think about that.
Yeah.
And Black economic empowerment. Policies that they have in the European countries that publish this publication. Policies that we have here in the United States, but somehow it's not good for Africans in South Africa. You know, that just reveals the deep-seated, it's just pure racism, you know? But it's so deep-seated, they don't even see it that way, okay?
Okay.
And this constant referring to the DA as market-oriented, as if the ANC is not, as if the ANC has bureaucrats there sitting down and setting price policies in a socialist system. Who is more capitalist than Cyril Ramaphosa? How did it end up with $4 million in his sofa that was found, that he had stitched in his sofa, right? But by constantly referring to the DA as market-oriented, they don't have to address the fact that the DA is actually saying no land reform. And then you talk about corruption, right? What can be more corrupt than 7.2% of the population saying we're entitled to 72% of the land, which is what the Europeans have today in South Africa? Is there anything more corrupt than that? But that somehow is not seen as corruption by this this media outlet. There's so many things, but since we pointed to most of them in the previous commentary, this to me is the most important. And look, they got the ministry that they actually were salivating over. The leader of the DA, Steenhuisen, he got the Ministry of Agriculture. He is the Minister of Agriculture, which is going to be in charge
control land,
of the land, and is going to maintain the status quo, which is structural apartheid.
Yep.
They got what they wanted, and this is what the global corporate media is celebrating.
Yep.
And it's very dangerous. It tells you their true attitude toward Africans generally and Black South Africans. They're saying not entitled to minimum wage, not entitled to Black economic empowerment that is meant to redress the structural employment racism over centuries since South Africa was occupied and over decades since apartheid became official policy. You're not entitled to land. That is why we're not talking about it. They didn't mention land. Yep. None of them have mentioned land since the elections, whether it's The Economist, whether it's the Financial Times, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the BBC.
The Guardian.
It is very chilling. So if you didn't know how Europeans, because this media addresses the issues that are critical to Europeans, if you didn't know their attitude toward Africans, I suggest you read all these articles published before and after the election and see how many of them are referring to the land inequity in South Africa. Because if you speak about it, then you have to propose what are the possible ways that this crisis is going to be addressed. So that's why I've been saying consistently that I don't think this alliance, this so-called government of national unity, has a long shelf life. They cannot put off this conversation over the land issue perpetually. You saw what happened in Zimbabwe, right? In Zimbabwe, after the Lancaster Agreement was signed, leading to the election that ended apartheid in what was then Rhodesia, the British government had committed to provide money to buy the lands from the descendants of the Europeans that stole it. And the United States government agreed to match the money. And then later, a subsequent administration came into power in Britain and reneged on that. And the US said, if the British are not going to be providing money, there's nothing for us to match, you see? And that provoked the forceful seizure of the land in Zimbabwe. How are you going to deal with it in a different way in South Africa? If the party that you are in partnership with opposes land redistribution, and now they control the agriculture portfolio, there are stormy days ahead in South Africa. Stormy days ahead.
Which is why what we do here is very important, because we deconstruct stories that would normally just become a staple to the audience in the West, and give them a peek behind the curtains as to what the mindset is with regards to the depiction. Usually,
I'm glad you said that. It's very important, because if you don't know what they think about you, how are you going to deal with changing your condition? Because a lot of the choices, decisions you make are still dependent on powerful parts of the world that determine a lot of the actions in African countries. You see, we are still all beholden to the financial institutions. We don't have independent institutions that can compete with the World Bank for resources or the major private Western banks. We just don't, So that's why I say you're better off focusing your research and study into looking into the system. The system.
And also,
obviously, look at the systems, not so much individuals, but obviously we have some Africans who are just so brutal to fellow Africans. And those, obviously, we have to put our energy into trying to remove those as well. We can't have one person running a country for 38 years like we have in Uganda. We can't have a country run by one person like Cameroon for 42 years. We can't have a country run for almost 40 years as well, like Equatorial Guinea. Come on now. We can't. We are letting down our people. And that's why it's not surprising that now you see that war raging in Cameroon. A lot of it is rooted on this Paul Biya guy who's just been there forever, And now you have people within the same country, killing, sisters and brothers, and duplicate this, within several other African countries. We can't have that. So while we are critical of Western imperialism and the instruments they use, which is the corporate media, we must also be honest and critical of our own misrulers who abuse our people. And I actually, in the beginning, when the sister Mugo, who has joined the ancestors, said one thing I wanted to touch on as well. She said she's a human rights activist. That's very sad. That's very sad, because she's not talking about human rights out of some theoretical context. She's talking of the experience and brutality that she suffered directly at the hands of the authorities in her own Kenya, her birth country. You see? So now we are taking away so much good critical energy and intellect that we should be using to solve some of our other issues and challenges. Now we have to divert that into combating, these agents of imperialism who are the fellow Africans, Yeah, so I forgot to mention that, but I wanted to mention that.
Yes, and also the fact that she spent over 4 decades in exile.
Think about that.
Yeah, she
You
died in
know,
exile. So
this
it's
massive talent who should
yeah,
be, back home.
yeah. And for those of our viewers viewing this, if you find value, please like, share, and subscribe. And we need more numbers to, take this into the ether so that we can get more people, aware of what is sits behind those headlines. So anytime you pick up your Financial Times, your New York Times, or any other Western media, be it on cable, radio, you're forced to question. I mean, we're not talking conspiracy theory here. History backs up what we're talking about. So unfortunately, those history are also largely written by the Western press. The book I showed earlier, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, was taken off the shelf by Heinemann Press when they refused to publish it. That Kwame Nkrumah had to get it published by PANAF Press, Pan African Press. So it goes to show that, and this book, 60 odd years later, is still one of the most value expose on
Yeah,
how the African imperialist setup works on the
yeah.
African continent. I still enjoin people to get it.